Greetings, AP Bio students. Today we're going to take a look at meiosis. So before we get into meiosis, let me just kind of point out the obvious, which is, hey, that term sounds a lot like the term mitosis. And you're right. Mitosis and meiosis do have a fair amount in common, but keep in mind that they are very, very distinct processes that superficially look kind of similar, but fundamentally really have two very distinct purposes. So as we're going through, make sure you kind of keep mitosis in one side of your brain, meiosis in the other, and then allow for the overlap in the places where it's appropriate. So in our last screencast, we talked about Mendel, and we saw that Mendel helped us make predictions about the outcomes of crosses and the probability of passing on a certain trait. The thing is, though, Mendel had actually no idea about the cellular and molecular processes underlining his two laws. And so that's what we're going to get into right now. Mendel could kind of mathematically predict the probability of a certain trait appearing in an offspring, but he had no idea what was actually going on in the cell. So in this and the next chapter, we're going to look at what is actually happening in the cell to account for Mendel's laws. So to begin, we are going to take a closer look at the life cycle of animals. Animals, and remember, humans are animals, they could be asexual or sexual. An asexual life cycle is one in which an individual inherits all of its genetic material from a single parent. So, humans? Say no. Shake your head no. Not humans. Humans are not asexual. You have two parents. So, what kinds of organisms are asexual? Well, maybe you have some ideas. So, bacteria, remember that bacteria aren't animals, they're bacteria, but they do have an asexual life cycle, and they reproduce by binary fission. One individual divides, makes an exact copy of their DNA, and then divides into two new. So each offspring inherits all of its genetic material from a single parent. Strawberries, also not an animal, I'm not sure about that heading there, produce horizontal stems called runners that give rise to new individuals. And so here you have this lovely plant, and then it can send off these little horizontal runners, they're called, and then a new plant will arise and then shoot off, and then a new plant will arise. So a number of plants have asexual aspects of their life cycles. Here's one that actually is an animal, a Hydra. This is this tiny little organism. It's related to a jellyfish. It's like, that big. You can see them fairly easily with the naked eye, but they're tiny. You can also look at them under a microscope. They're small enough that you can zoom in on them. But they, while they do have a sexual life cycle, they also do have this asexual option, so to speak, to their life cycle called budding, where basically this little tiny bud forms and gives rise to this whole new Hydra, and then eventually pinches off. This one always seems awesome to me. I picture this little Mr. Sanger like emerging from my abdomen, like, hello, hello, and then boom, pops off, and there's two of me, and I'd always have a partner to play Mario Kart with. It'd be amazing. So Planaria is another example that does asexual reproduction. A Planaria is this little worm right here. It actually normally only has one head, but Hydra, starfish, Planaria, they all do this asexual process called fragmentation, where if you take a Planaria and you just cut it in half, and I've done this for students, these worms are like that big, and they're swimming around inside this little bowl of water in a petri dish, and you can just go with a razor blade and chop them in half, and it kind of continues going about its business like it's no big deal. And then sure enough, each of those two halves will give rise to an entire new individual, genetically identical to the original. Hydra can be broken in half this way as well, and starfish too. If you break off a little arm, as was done here, that arm will give rise to a whole new starfish. So this is kind of like the little baby starfish that's emerging from this initial arm. Again, in all these cases, the offspring will be genetically identical to that parent. Here's a crazy one, Copperhead snakes. Certain fairly complex animals can actually do asexual reproduction in certain instances. So these snakes have this process. It's called parthenogenesis, and the females actually produce genetically identical offspring with no male involved. How long have women been longing for this opportunity? So a cell called a polar body, and we are going to look at what a polar body is later in this unit, but basically it's this product of meiosis that's not really utilized. That little polar body actually functions as a sperm and can fertilize an egg, and voila, you can give rise to a baby snake in this way with no male involved. That was kind of the idea in the movie Jurassic Park, how the female-only creatures were able to reproduce, if you remember that. This, by the way, was discovered because a woman had a copperhead snake in a tank and showed up one morning and there was a baby in there. Okay, so asexual life cycle, kind of interesting, but the focus really is going to be on the sexual life cycle. This is what humans exhibit, and most mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and most plants for that matter, have a sexual life cycle. And this is where a cycle where genetic material from two organisms is combined. So that's really what sex is. Humans have this kind of PG-13 attitude about what sex is. All sex is biologically is it's taking genetic material from two organisms and joining them together. So to understand this, I want to take a look at the life cycle of a human. And so I'm going to pause this. We're going to go to the dot cam, new and improved dot cam I got, and we'll model this out. So we'll draw a picture right in here. Okay, camera 2. I'm developing a regular film studio here. So the life cycle, we'll just take a look at humans, for example. It always begins with a male and a female. And we'll use this kind of X to kind of represent like a genetic cross, almost kind of a deal. Now, previously we introduced these terms haploid and diploid. And for the most part, almost every cell in a male or female adult body, and maybe I'll just add adult here to each of these because they're adults. Every cell in that adult body is one of the others, a haploid or diploid, you know. Say diploid, it's diploid. So we represent that as 2N, okay? So in almost every cell in the male's body, there are 2 copies of each gene, of each chromosome, and the adult female, 2 copies of each gene. Now, what happens is, in certain cells in the body, this new process that we haven't talked about yet takes place, and that process is meiosis. And in meiosis, what happens is the diploid cell is divided essentially into a haploid cell. And in males, there is one cell type in the entire male body that happens to be haploid, and I think you remember what that one is. It's the sperm cells. So during meiosis, this diploid cell is converted into a haploid sperm cell. Same thing can happen in females, but it's a different cell type that comes together, and that cell type is the egg cell. So now we have these haploid cells, sperm and egg, and then these sperm and egg, assuming that the adult male and female are at least 29 years of age, in a committed relationship, financially secure, they may come together and form what is called a zygote. And since we have half the DNA from dad and half the DNA from mom, that zygote is going to be diploid again. And the process where sperm and egg come together, you've probably heard of this one. It's the F word, sperm and egg come together. That's right, fertilization. See what I did there? It's a little PG-13, this screencast. So fertilization is where the sperm and egg come together and form a zygote, and then that zygote is going to eventually grow and develop into a new adult, and it could either be an adult male or an adult female, depending on which combination of chromosomes it gets. So then the life cycle continues. So back to camera 1. So to recap that lovely process that we just went through here, meiosis, or the sexual life cycle, kind of consists of these 2 phases. There's meiosis that halves the chromosome number to produce these haploid gametes, as they're called. Sperm and egg are called gametes. And then fertilization is where those 2 haploid gametes come together again to form the diploid zygote. So essentially, we keep the chromosome number constant over the generations by cutting it in half and then combining them. Cut in half, combine, cut in half, combine. And so here's like a prettier picture of that if you like that. So now let's take a look at the human genome a little bit. Oh yeah, in order to do that, we need to take a moment to review a few things. And so I want you to take a moment and just answer these questions. Hit pause, and then unpause, and away we go. So describe the structure of the nucleus in terms, including the terms nuclear envelope, nuclear pores. We've gone over this a number of times. Remember, the nucleus has a double membrane around it with these nuclear pores in the middle that allow things to pass through. The terms diploid versus haploid, gamete versus somatic cell, chromatin versus chromosome. So diploid, remember, we have 2 copies of each chromosome. Haploid, we have 1 copy of each chromosome. And again, each of these 2 copies, one comes from mom, one comes from dad. One comes from mom, one comes from dad, etc. Gamete versus somatic cells. Gametes are haploid and include the sperm and the egg. Somatic cells are diploid and are pretty much every other cell in the body. Chromatin versus chromosome. Both of these are essentially the same thing. It's DNA wrapped around proteins and coiled up. It's just the degree of coiling that has taken place. So remember, chromatin was kind of, we just sort of drew kind of this twisty, tangly mess of DNA in the cell. That's kind of how it is in interphase. And the chromosome is if we coil that up really tight into these little X-shaped or line-shaped structures, depending on whether or not it's replicated. And then we have them in chromosomes during the cell cycle. Okay. What is the purpose of mitosis? So to review mitosis, 3 main purposes. If you're a single-celled organism, eukaryotic cell, of course, because only eukaryotes do mitosis. Bacteria do binary fission. So this is a single-celled organism that's a eukaryote. It'll use mitosis for reproduction. Humans, we use mitosis for growth and for wound healing, basically to generate new cells in the case of growth as we get bigger, and to replace damaged cells after a wound. And then just sort of modeling the process of mitosis. You recall in interphase, the DNA is kind of stored as this loose, tangled chromatin. Then in prophase, the chromosomes condense into these little X-shaped things. The spindle begins to form. The spindle attaches and kind of does a tug-of-war thing until eventually they line all the chromosomes up down the center. At that point, we say we're in metaphase. Anaphase, those chromosomes are pulled apart, and then in telophase, it pinches into 2 cells. Importantly, I forgot to mention that in interphase, the DNA is copied. And so that these 2 halves of the X called sister chromatids are identical. So when we pull them to opposite ends of the cell, each new cell gets an identical copy. So mitosis is all about creating a genetically identical daughter cell. So now with that background, we can look a little more closely at the human genome. So the human genome, we can see this diagram is called a karyotype, which simply shows all the chromosomes arranged by size. So chromosome 1 is the biggest, then chromosome 2, chromosome 3, all the way down to chromosome 22. The somatic cell, and actually I'll just mention that this 23rd pair is the X and Y sex chromosomes. So somatic cells are all the cells except sperm and egg, so skin cells, muscle cells, bone cells, blood cells. And those somatic cells contain 46 chromosomes, and these 46 chromosomes are arranged as pairs. So we say that somatic cells are diploid. They have 23 pairs of homologous chromosomes. Homologous chromosomes contain the same type of genetic information, but are not identical. So one came from mom, and one came from dad. So you can see here, these are homologous chromosomes. One is a big G, one is a little g. Same information, but not identical. Note that this is different from sister chromatids, which are the 2 identical copies of each where they're the same. So here the red has 2 sister chromatids and the blue has 2 sister chromatids. And so we talked about this with pea plants, right? One copy could code for purple, one could code for white. They're homologous. We're about to run out of time, so I think I'll pause and we'll pick this up in our next screencast.